We are delighted to welcome Phillip Roope and Kevin Meagher, who will discuss their recently published book, Shark Arm, A Shark, a Tattooed Arm, and Two Unsolved Murders. Phillip and Kevin are former high school history teachers whose careers have migrated into the world of film and television. I will let them tell you, everyone, about the most famous local school student from Randwick City. The pair have taught in the film industry and have worked on TV series such as Blue Murder and the Baz Luhrmann film, The Great Gatsby. In Shark Arm, the authors present a well-researched and thoroughly gripping tale of complex criminal underworld operating in Sydney by the mid-1930s. Amongst a milieu of upper-class boat builders from Sydney's North Shore and everyday gangsters from all over the city, there was a smorgasbord of criminal activity. Insurance fraud, forgery, drug smuggling and SP bookmaking, to name just some of the dubious criminal activities that were rife at the time in interwar Sydney. And then, amidst it all, on Anzac Day in 1935, a man's arm is disgorged by a captured tiger shark at our very own Coogee Aquarium. At the time of this crime, Sydney's overworked CIB Police Department were already struggling with a string of unsolved murders. The authors will share with us the fruits of their primary research. Do they manage to shed new light on the case? Let us hear what they have to say about that. On the Shark Arm murder, Kate McClymont, journalist, said, "It is a truly gripping whodunit, which throws fresh light on one of Australia's most extraordinary murders. It is my absolute pleasure on behalf of Randwick City Library to welcome Phillip and Kevin here this evening with us. Good evening to you both."
Good evening, Georgina.
Thank you for joining us. Phil and Kev, we've decided to open this up to an in-conversation style with the two of you, and we will discuss a series of questions that take our audience through the chronology of your work, which I have to say, having finished quite late last night, was a gripping read in bed. It is truly a great narrative bringing together what I know is very detailed and complex research. The first question that we're going to discuss is what drew you both to this case in particular, Phil?
Well, thank you very much, Georgina. It's a pleasure to be here. We, as you said, we're ex-English history high school teachers. Kevin and I taught just down the road together in the late 70s and early 80s at Morris Brothers High School, and we used to tell the students in classes about the shark arm. It was in a school text, and it was an unfailing success. Every time we told the story, students responded in a very positive way to it. So we decided that we knew from then that it was a gripping yarn. The thing about it is that it is unsolved, and the extraordinary circumstances that led to the discovery of the arm, the odds against it ever happening were beyond belief. But while it had a killer opening, it never had an ending. The person who was charged with it was acquitted. Other people were brought on other charges, not directly related to the arm, to the arm coming up, but it was basically an amazing beginning to what is a quintessentially Australian story. It's almost like this story could only happen in Australia. And at the time when the shark vomited up the arm, it made headlines all around Australia and even as far afield as London. So look, what I might do is, if I can quickly read what Kev and I have put together as a 3-minute very quick summation of the main points of the shark arm story, so that those people who haven't heard it can understand the main elements to the story.
Certainly.
So on the 25th of April 1935, a 14-foot tiger shark caught 9 days earlier off the New South Wales coast horrified holiday makers at a Sydney aquarium when it vomited up a human arm. The arm, bearing a distinctive tattoo of 2 boxes in sparring pose, was soon identified as belonging to James Smith, a small-time criminal and part-time skipper of the Pathfinder, a luxury yacht rumoured to have been involved in drug running off the New South Wales coast. Police believe Smith was murdered on the night of 8th of April in a Port Hacking holiday cottage in Sydney South, his body cut up and dumped in the ocean in a tin trunk, the arm left out to show others that the gruesome job had been done. The origins of the murder, they believe, lay in a decision by the Pathfinder's owners, Albert Stannard and Reginald Holmes, 2 respected North Shore businessmen, to have Smith scuttle the yacht after insuring it for more than double its true value. Smith bungled the sinking. The businessmen lost a fortune and Smith was paid only a small portion of the agreed fee. In his anger, he threatened to reveal what he knew of the Pathfinder scam and the wealthy businessmen's other crooked activities. He had become a risk and his days were numbered. When his arm miraculously reappeared, Smith's best mate, Patrick Brady, a conman and forger, was charged with the murder. The detectives certainly had cause to suspect him. In the days after he was last seen drinking with Smith at a Cronulla hotel, he replaced a trunk in the cottage with a new one, replaced a mattress in one of the bedrooms, bought a new anchor and rope for a launch he had hired, and on leaving the cottage, scrubbed the place clean. Police searched for the trunk in nearby waters, but found nothing. Without a body, the police case against Patrick Brady collapsed and he was acquitted. But things went from bad to worse for the beleaguered detectives. The night before Reginald Holmes was to appear as a star witness in the coronial inquiry into Smith's death, he was found shot dead in his car under the Harbour Bridge. His business partner, Albert Stannard, identified by a witness as having been at the murder scene that night, stood trial with one of his employees, Patrick Strong. Despite Strong's fingerprints being found on the passenger door of Holmes's car, both men were acquitted. 2 murders and no convictions. Who killed Jimmy Smith and his boss, Reginald Holmes, and why? How were these murders connected? Patrick Brady went to his grave swearing he did not murder his mate, but he never revealed who did. That silence has lasted for 85 years. So look, that's as good as we can give for an encapsulation of the facts of the story and the issues at stake. We were led into this story because basically who killed Jimmy Smith and who killed Reginald Holmes before we wrote this book were not answered.
Okay, why don't I launch a poll and see how many of our community online tonight have read the book already. I will share that with people now. They can fill it in, and in a moment I will publish the results. People can fill it in and we get a rough idea of who has already read the book. So I will end the poll in about another 10 seconds. We can add another 1 person because I've read the book. So we have 3 people, 4 people online who have read the book tonight. Some people have started, 2 people, and about half have not yet read it. So I will end the poll now. So that gives us a good indication that most of our community are not familiar with the absolute level of detail that is in your book. It's one of the privileges of my job to help people such as yourselves every day But I have to say, the narrative that you have drawn around the primary level research in this case is absolutely outstanding. It's a gripping read from beginning to end, and it has a big reveal at the end. What amazed me that only 20 years after the landing on Gallipoli that the Coogee Aquarium was open for business on Anzac Day. Did that not startle you?
Yes, and what happened on that day was quite amazing as well. The actual shark, the arm coming from the shark, was an event that was seen by only a handful of people, around about 15 people on that afternoon, the 25th of April 1935, were in the aquarium, and they were watching the shark that by that time had been caught off Coogee 9 days before on a fixed line put out by the brother of the owner of the aquarium, Albert Hobson, and he had put out some fixed lines. He had a fishing boat, and with this fixed line, there's some fixed lines with mackerel on it. He had left them overnight, and when he came back the next morning, he found that he had this 4.4 meter huge tiger shark, which normally would not be able to be, brought into shore. But he thought it was the perfect exhibit for his brother's aquarium. So it was towed ashore. 9 days later, it was very lethargic. And 9 days later, it didn't seem to eat much, and it was lying listlessly at one end, the deep end of the pool. The aquarium is in the lower photo that you can see there. It wasn't an aquarium. During the day, during the summer, it was a bathing place, a bathing pool, and it was at the northern end of where the pointer is, behind the dome there. And during the winter, when people dropped off to make money, they actually tried to get exhibits into it, like fish, and at one point they even had a sea leopard. It's a tiny suburban pool with a shallow end and a deep end. The shark was in the shallow end of the pool. It suddenly shook off its lethargy and started to swim around the pool, getting faster and faster, and water sloshing out to the sides. And it did this in the pool a couple of times, and then at the shallow end, at the deep end, which is the end closest to the camera, it suddenly sank to the bottom, went still, then a scum rose to the surface, and the 15 people who were witnessing it smelt this dreadful stench, and as they craned forward to look, an arm was quite visible, floating in the scum that had been vomited up by the shark. One of the people who noticed it was a press photographer, and not a press photographer, he was a proofreader for the Sydney Morning Herald, and his name was Narcisse Young, and he was obviously a very keen observer and very precise, and he definitely, as all the other people who witnessed it, saw the arm float up to the surface in the scum.
So you detail in the book why was the arm in such a good state of preservation when it was found. Would you like to elaborate on that, Phil?
Yes, the fact that when Bert Hobson had put down the lines, he put down multiple lines, and the shark itself, the first shark, it wasn't the first shark that was on the line. A smaller shark had taken the line, and then the bigger shark had come in and snatched at the smaller shark and bitten a section of the shark, the small shark, which obviously contained the arm. And so when that bigger shark got then tangled in the lines, when it was in the aquarium, the lights and the strange environment, it was theorized that the shark gave up eating, and its digestive processes were not the normal processes. But beyond that, the fact was that the arm was encased in the smaller shark, the portion of the smaller shark that the big shark had taken a grab at. So the shark's digestive system, and sharks' digestive systems can digest anything really, was working not at the same rate it would normally, and it was digesting the portion of the smaller shark that contained the arm. So when the arm surfaced after 9 days, a few, days in the ocean, and then having been eaten by the smaller shark, and then eaten by the bigger shark, it had been encased and not actually touched by the digestive juices. So it was in virtually a perfect state of preservation. The fingerprints were very, very clear.
We have had a question from the audience, Philip. I don't know the answer to this. The dimensions of the aquarium pool, did you come across that? I know you used one of the only very few internal images of the pool that I'm aware of, which happens to be courtesy of the best public library in Sydney, if not the world.
Would that be the Lionel Bowen Library?
Yes, with very helpful staff.
I know you were. It's a fantastic photo.
What a great team.
Yeah, and it was still in operation in the 1950s. I have a friend who used to go there as a child.
I have met, since I've worked at the library, people who may even be in the online audience tonight who have swum at that pool. Yep, so there is, Tim had learnt to swim at the old aquarium pool in the 60s, and I know of other people that I've met that have quite fond memories of the place. So Judith as well has said that she swum at the pool. So people might revise their desire to swim in the pool as a child if they'd known that it had been teeming with sharks at one stage. And I did like, as a librarian, the interesting connection with the person who was consulted on shark digestion, I think at the coronial inquest. If you could share the story of who their daughter was.
It was a man called Stead. And his daughter was
Christina Stead.
Christina Stead, the author. And strangely enough, he was an authority on sharks. And he gave that, that the digestive processes by the lights and the strange environment had stopped, and that's why the arm was in such a good state of preservation. But I think the dimensions of the pool, it was so cruel to have put such big creatures in this pool. None of the ones that they ever exhibited lasted very long. They died after a couple of weeks. So I think the dimensions of the pool are just a suburban pool. It's 50 by, just a suburban pool, shallow end and a deep end.
So there's several people who are commenting that they learnt to swim in the late 60s at the pool, so it was obviously still operating as a pool by then.
Wow.
And Tim asks a question, did they remove the marine animals from the pool when it was open for human swimmers? So I'm not quite sure about that, Tim. So Barry's asking a question that we might field at the end with the Q&A from the floor, because we have a few to get through to take us through the chronology of the book. So I'll bear that in mind. Philip, do we still need to continue to screen share with you to illustrate what you're talking
just
about?
tell me to. There we go.
We've had a request to see your lovely visage. So
How do I do that?
you're there, you're in live, it's working really well.
Yeah. Oh my God, shock.
So I would like to know and move on to the next question. How did the police discover that this wasn't just a shark attack, but something more sinister?
Well, on the following day, by the way, hello everybody, I'm Kevin. The following day after the shark vomited up the arm, Friday the 26th of April, the arm was taken to the city morgue and it was examined by the New South Wales Chief Medical Officer. His name was Dr. Palmer, and also a surgeon and Sydney University professor, Dr. Victor Coppelson. Coppelson also had a special interest in shark attacks upon humans, and he had presented a paper once showing all the different teeth marks depending on which shark made the attack. But both these gentlemen examined the arm, and quite quickly they came to the following conclusions. The first one was that the arm was certainly not bitten off in a shark attack. Secondly, that there was no way that it was removed surgically. There was no professionalism shown whatever about how it came off. It was just hacked off. The third point was it was hacked off by a sharp instrument, and that was possibly a kitchen knife. And the fourth thing that they concluded was they thought it was highly likely that the arm was removed from a dead body and not an alive body. In the inquest, the learned doctors gave these opinions exactly as I've just mentioned them, but Evatt, who was defending Brady, jumped to his feet and said, is it possible that a person could survive, an alive person who had his arm removed could have survived that? Both the doctors said it was highly unlikely that the person would die from shock or from blood loss, but it wasn't being pressed by Evatt. The doctors said, no, that's not 100% certain. It's the most likely outcome and highly probable, but a person may have survived that. And that kind of answer suited Evatt because it created doubt whether Smith may still be alive, may not be dead and still be alive. And that suited Evatt's cause very nicely.
Kevin, could you just explain to our online audience who Evatt was as well, defending Paddy, because I think it actually made his legal career.
Evatt was part of the Evatt family. They lived in Newcastle, and his brother was H.V. Evatt, who was a minister in a federal government, and I think he was the Attorney General, and then he went to the United Nations in New York as well. Clive was his younger brother. Clive also served in the New South Wales, served as a politician, this time in the New South Wales Parliament. Clive was also an actor at Sydney, in the Sydney University Drama Club. He played rugby league as a front row in Sydney and represented New South Wales. And he had a great art collection, and he only died quite. That's a son. Yeah, I'm getting mixed up with generations there. But his sister, Elizabeth Evatt, was the first commissioner, or was the commissioner for the Royal Commission into Human Relations set up by the Whitlam government. And when that was finished, when that commission wound up, she was appointed as the first Chief Justice of the family court. So quite a famous family in legal history.
Okay. So the next question that we are going to take us through the chronology, you say in the book that the origin of Jim Smith's murder lay in the scuttling of a yacht called the Pathfinder. The two owners of the yacht were regarded as respectable North Shore businessmen, Can you give us a bit of background on them? And I'd also like to add, Kev, can you give us a bit of the detail of the luxury appointments on this yacht?
I'll leave the luxury appointment of the detail about the boat, and I'll just address the first part of the question. The two people in question that Georgina mentioned are Reginald Holmes and Albert Stannard. Both men inherited their boat businesses from their fathers. Reg Holmes' father built yachts and launches and speedboats. They built the first speedboats ever built in Australia. And Reg Holmes' business was a flourishing business, and it also had agencies for 8 popular marine engines, and he had agents all around Australia. So he's doing very, very well out of the boating business. Reg was also a well-respected businessman. His boat shed was at McMahon's Point, and it was just down the road from his splendid home. Albie Stannard also inherited his father's business. His family were watermen, and watermen rowed passengers and crew from ship to shore. Passengers, crew and other items, I might add, to and from the ships which were anchored in the harbour. Motorboats introduced by the Stannards were introduced to that service, and that basically ended the careers of the watermen. No more rowing, they went out in powered boats. Stannard was, he finished up with a stranglehold on that market, the ship-to-shore services. Stannard was a sportsman. He was a seriously competitive sailor, successfully competing in many yacht races. He was a hail fellow, well met. He was known for shouting his work as a beer, and both men were respected citizens. They were well known around the harbour, and they were members of Sydney's prestigious clubs. They were pillars of society, and Phil in the writing says, as a lovely description for them, he describes them as Sydney Harbour royalty, and that was true. They were the big shots on Sydney Harbour, such that their personal integrity was never reported. However, there is another story, and the story is told by Detective Sergeant Matthews, who wrote a 15-page report in December 1935 about the Shark Arm murders. And he had quite a different view of these two gentlemen. Firstly, he said that Holmes was known to associate with criminals. He's alleged to have conspired to sink or burn over-insured boats. He was alleged to have received stolen property, and he was ruthlessly and relentlessly blackmailed by criminals. Of Stannard, Detective Sergeant Matthews said that he was associated and employed with known criminals, and he was an alleged receiver of stolen goods. Both these men, incidentally, or to finish up with, I should say, both of these men had employed James Smith in scam business arrangements, much to their profit.
So that segues nicely into our next discussion. How did Jim Smith bungle the scuttling of this luxury yacht called the Pathfinder? Phil?
Well, the Pathfinder was a beautifully built boat, very long and sleek and beautiful design and beautiful bespoke interiors. And it was bought by Holmes and Stannard in 1934, late 1933. And through 1934, it was put to Jim Smith that what they did was they got inspectors to estimate the cost of to insure it for amounts that were much. It was insured for more than half its double its value, and no one doubted these men because of their background. No men were in a better position to know what a boat was worth, especially Holmes. So this boat was insured for an absolute fortune in today's money. And then Jim Smith, in their employ, was given the job of scuttling it. And it was taken to Pittwater, and it was decided how it was going to be done, and it was going to be done by opening, smashing water pipes below the line in the boat. And Jim Smith was alone on the boat. It was taken out of Pittwater, and just off Terrigal, he estimated how far he would need to go into shore. So he came out in the morning, just in the first light. He made his way just off Terrigal. He went below, smashed the pipes. Water started to come into the boat, but not as quickly as he imagined, he thought. And then he came out on deck to get the rowboat that he was going to row to shore in ready. And to his horror, a small steamer that was carrying coal from Catherine Hill Bay to Sydney was approaching because the captain of the steamer had seen that the boat was listing and in a bad way. And Jim Smith made a decision that was, which was very, very decisive in what later happened. He got into the rowboat with the boat listing and just about to disappear, and he started to row away from the boat towards Terrigal. And as the steamer came closer, the captain hailed to him, did he need any help? And he didn't even turn around, he just kept rowing towards the shore. And the steamer went past and then went to Sydney and reported this very odd event to the police in Sydney. Meanwhile, as they proceeded, Jim Smith rowed for the shore, but it was the wind had come up, and he had terrible trouble reaching. It was about 1.5 miles off Terrigal, and against the swell, he had terrible trouble getting in. He finally got to the southern end of the beach and collapsed exhausted onto the beach. But then he managed to get himself up to the police station, because this was all going to be prearranged. And he reported that he had just got off a boat that had sunk, and he asked the policeman, the sergeant there, to ring the owner of the boat so he could inform him. And he named Holmes. The sergeant remembered him later, asking for, could a Mr. Holmes, when he finally answered the call, he asked for a Mr. Holmes. So he really did point the finger. He bungled it completely. And basically, he cost that syndicate a huge amount of money by his bungling. And they were very angry. They were very fearful of their reputations. And there was no way they were going to pay him the £500 that he thought he was owed. But he was determined to get it, because he had nearly lost his life in the sinking of their ship for them. And
it became a critical pivot point, really, in the whole linking of various murders then in Sydney, which is part of your thesis that's discussed in the book. How big was the drug scene in Sydney in 1935, and how is this all connected to this criminal activity, Phil?
Well, every ship that came into Sydney in 1935, a lot of the ships, in 1935, 6,700 ships came into Sydney. It was the only way that people could arrive from overseas. And it was reputed at that time that Sydney was the cocaine capital of the world. And it was imported from South America, in ships coming from South America, while opium came from ships coming from Asia. And both Holmes and Stannard were in a perfect position with people who ran the boats for them to meet the boats, to pick up passengers or cargo that was offloaded if they were anchored in Sydney Harbour, or to go offshore as the boats were passing and retrieve parcels that were thrown overboard by pre-design. And the Pathfinder was reputedly part of that offshore smuggling before they decided to sink it. But the detectives, at that time, the drugs were not, the police didn't have the powers or didn't exercise the powers over drugs that they do today. And the drug squad, which only had 2 men in 1935, made only 3 arrests in the prior 3 years, 1932 to 35, for cocaine. But we found in the police reports that we got with all the police files a report of a smuggling operation that had 2 drums full of cocaine worth a huge amount of money. So they tried to spread the story that the only people who were peddling in drugs in Sydney at that era were prostitutes or Chinese people smoking opium. But the cocaine scene was big. It was called, taking cocaine was, you could buy for 5 shillings. It was called the 5 shilling sniff, and it was a really well-known and big trade.
Do you actually think that the Holmes family were heavily involved in that drug scene? And do you want to elaborate on the connection with the Hobsons yet, or do you want to leave that to later on?
Look, if we could leave it till later on, I think that'd be good.
Okay. So Barry has a question which he's been patiently awaiting an answer for. How much did you draw on Alex Castle's book about the murder?
We drew a lot on Alex Castle's book. He was able to interview detectives who had worked on the case, and he did have access to the files. But we drew on it a lot because he had, especially for the interviews that Paddy gave to the detectives and the way that they interviewed him. But we got all the police files and were given copies of them so that we were able to study them at leisure. Castles was only given 5 days to look at certain files, and we are sure that there were files that we had access to that he probably wasn't shown. He had a legal background, so he was interested in the he was very interested in the legal aspects to the case, whether an arm constituted a body, and he won a big victory by closing down the inquest because it was only an arm, and many people were walking around with one arm and still alive, obviously. Yes, we drew heavily on Castle's book, but in his conclusions were that while Brady wasn't guilty, he nominated a guy called Wayman, which we believe was just not so. And he didn't really mention in the book, he didn't make a connection as we have made between the 2 murders. And that connection is that the same men killed both men.
Okay. Do we need to share the screen, Philip, or we're going to discuss that still, or would you like to take it back? We've got another image coming up. So I will ask you, the police believe Patrick Brady killed his best mate right up to the end, even though he denied it. How much evidence on him was there, Kev?
Overall, I would say there was not a lot of evidence, but there was a lot of suspicion, and that's about as much as the police could garnish their. Let me elaborate on that. Brady was the last man to be seen with Smith. They left the Cecil Hotel in Cronulla around about 6 p.m. on Monday night, the April 8. They returned, there's no doubt that both men returned back to the holiday cottage at Gunnemutter Bay, but that was the last time anyone ever saw Smith. I want to cut straight to a thing called what was known as the cell door incident. Holmes had made a statement. Reginald Holmes had been talking to the police and decided to make a statement to the police about Brady, or about general, a broad range of things. And amongst them was this statement of Brady. And in the statement, he said that on April the 9th, the day after Smith disappeared, Brady came to his house and he said, and he told Holmes that he and Smith had had a row, and that Brady killed Smith, put his body into a trunk, rowed it out of Port Hacking, and rowed a boat out of Port Hacking, and then threw the trunk overboard to be swallowed up by the ocean. Now, it's a pretty outlandish kind of claim that Holmes made, but we'll come back to that in a moment. At the cell door, while Brady was being held, the detective showed Brady the statement that Holmes had made. And they made the observation that when he read the piece about him killing Smith, Brady, the police said that his face changed colour, he appeared shaky, and his voice quivered. And then he said, "Okay, that's all right. Is there anything else?" That piece of evidence, called the cell door incident, was almost central to the prosecution's case against Pat Brady. There were other things that, as I mentioned, that aroused the police's suspicions, and they claimed that, or a couple of them are, that he claimed that he bumped into Smith on a railway station on April 9, that's the day after he disappeared. He also completely made up a story to explain why he took the boat out and where he went with the boat on the morning of April the 10th, that was the Wednesday, and that is a very important event. And he denied writing a letter to Jim Smith's son, Raymond. And in the letter he said his father was okay, Jim was okay, and he would be home soon. So he also said that he didn't spend any time at Cronulla. So Brady made told lots and lots of lies. He went and bought a mattress and a tin trunk, and he placed them back in the cottage at Port Hacking. When he was asked to explain why he bought these two items, he remained silent, and again that aroused the suspicion. However, once the Judge Jordan just set aside the cell door incident, the police prosecution was basically shambolic. They had not much more to say. Clive Everett indicated to the judge that it's time to shut this murder case down, that Brady had no case to answer, and the police had produced barely any evidence, and some of it might be called circumstantial. And with that, they shut the case down after a day and a half, and Brady was declared not guilty.
Didn't the police actually take Brady through his movements those couple of days, and they indulged in a glass of port at a hotel at Port Hacking while they were gathering his statement? There were some pretty dubious police practices back then, and I'm sure that Clive Everett had a field day with that in the courtroom. So it was pretty...
Phil, can you throw some light on that, Phil?
Look, taxi drivers in those days, this was part of the delight of this book, that through the police files, and especially them tracking down Brady's movements after he left Port Hacking, what the taxi drivers reported was gives a little bit of an insight into that era. Every time Brady got into a taxi, he seemed to end up in a pub with the taxi driver. And when he bought the mattress, for instance, he said, "Oh, mate, I haven't got any money on me. Can you lend me 7 and 6pence?" And which the taxi driver did. And later, he didn't have enough money for the taxi fare, and so the taxi driver and he had a drink. They made an arrangement to meet the next day when Brady would pay him back, and indeed they did. And that was not an uncommon occurrence. That it was a very trusting era, very naive and trusting era.
It was indeed. I have had a question from the floor of, I assume we're talking about the coronial inquest. Kathy Nelson has asked who was the judge, because I think the repartee between Clive Evatt and the judge was quite telling in that case, and it apparently set legal precedent for the coronial court from then on. Can you answer that question, Philip or Kevin?
I forgot his name. Ormond, was it, Phil?
No, the coronial inquest. The coroner Oram.
Oram, O-R-A-M.
O-R-A-M.
Yeah, Oram.
Yes, Coroner Oram and Evatt clashed in the most incredible way, and Evatt was scathing in his assessment of Oram and his conducting of the case, because he was never shown any files. Evatt was, even though he was defending Brady, he was never shown any files in the coronial inquest. Anybody could say anything. Hearsay evidence was admissible. The sensation of the case, people lining up outside, people having to throw people, police having to throw people out because the court became overpacked. All these things, Evatt tried to get his client a fair go, but the most dreadful allegations against Brady were reported in the press, and Evatt did his best, but there was nothing wrong, nothing he could do. Oram kept admitting evidence and saying, "There's nothing I can do. These witnesses have said what they've said in court, and I can't do anything." And at times, Evatt would say things like,
Evatt was on his. Sorry, you finished, Phil?
Yeah, good on you, Kev.
Evatt was on his feet in the first 5 minutes of the court, and he said, "You have no right, Mr. Oram, to be conducting this inquest because you don't have a body. You can't conduct an inquest into the death of a person if you only have the arm." And he fought that right for the next 3 or 4 days, until finally he went to the High Court, and the High Court of New South Wales shut the case down based on what Evatt had said in the first 5 minutes of the inquest. That you can't conduct an inquest if you haven't got a body, and an arm didn't count as a body.
I thought it was quite brutal of Evatt to get the wife of Smith to view the arm and the tattoo in the coroner's chamber next door to the courtroom. But we might speak to that in a question down the track about the women involved in the case. And I'm conscious of the fact that we need to keep on moving along to have enough time for people to ask questions at the end. Do we need to keep on sharing the screen for our next discussion?
There we go.
Okay, so how was it that the police let their star witness into Smith's death be murdered the night before the inquest? This is the coronial inquest. And did you ever get the impression that the police investigating were corrupt?
Yes, look, at the press hounded the detectives for not putting a guard and not protecting homes. Here was the star witness murdered the night before the inquest, and years after, the shadow Faye, one of the famous members of the Shadow Squad, he said in a book that he couldn't understand why the Shadow Squad hadn't been put on to look after Holmes. Matthews, in his defence, said that he'd asked Holmes whether he should be protected, and Holmes, that he said he was going to place a guard on his home, and Holmes apparently said rather oddly, no, I don't think that should be done because I don't know what the neighbours will think. This is after it was publicised that he'd shot himself on the harbour in a dramatic speedboat chase, and so notwithstanding nothing, the Shadow Squad was never put on him to watch him, and he was killed the night before the inquest. But strangely enough, nothing we saw in any of the police files, especially in the interviews with Brady, who would have squealed about his rights because he was a very obstinate person. The way they conducted themselves, and it was generally known that New South Wales detectives stuck to the law. They didn't verbal, and they didn't use physical violence. And amongst the detectives who were part of the case were Norman Allen was assisted the police prosecutor, and Fred Hansen was a member of the Shadow Squad. And both those men went on to become commissioners of police. But at this time, what we saw of the way the New South Wales police conducted themselves, they were gentlemen. They were not like what was other states were reputed to have been. And this was shown in the transcripts of the statement taken, that they stuck to it. They believed that they would get their man if they just wore him down by, in the process of interviews. But they were hounded by the press, and they had the Pajama Girl case, and they had other cases that throughout the 30s they had been unable to solve. And the press said to them, the Truth, for instance, Truth, who's Ezra Norton, lived in Randwick, down at Maroubra, in Torrington Street. His Truth newspaper was the most virulent, and it said in one issue around about this time, are the police getting dumber or are the criminals getting smarter? And so those commissioners, those later commissioners, saw a police force who dealt within the law having absolutely no success whatsoever. And I think that possibly later on, those commissioners in the 50s and then into the 60s let detectives use other methods to ensure success. And I think there's a direct connection between men like Detective Fred Cray and then later Rogerson. But at this point, we saw, look, it's an inexplicable thing why Matthews didn't protect him, but it was one of those things. We didn't see anything that would have said that the detectives who investigated the case were corrupt.
And then Matthews himself was selected to run a dual op later on, investigating the drug squad, and you'll speak to that later in our narrative. So I will progress on slightly, just to say that you have identified 5 men with being involved not just with Smith's death, but with Holmes' death as well. How do you come to such a definite conclusion, Phil?
Well, look, I think we were lucky enough to have all the police evidence in the files. So basically, we just absorbed all of those, and then we put together a timeline. And strangely enough, a timeline made sense of things which we couldn't make sense of in previous books or in the newspaper reports of the day. It was, we absorbed everything in the files, and we put them in order, created a timeline, and we were able to read things that the detectives really thought, and their theories. But the main thing in the files was Matthew's report. And Matthew's report was written after everyone was at the end of the year. By the end of 1935, no one was convicted, and the commissioner, Mackay, asked for a report on basically saying, well, why weren't you successful after this huge expense? And that report was the most revealing. He believed that Brady was guilty, but he certainly believed that there was no doubt that Stannard and Strong were guilty. And I think in that, when you read the evidence of Strong and Stannard trials for the murder of Holmes, we saw that there was evidence that there had been a lot of money thrown at witnesses who the police interviewed, changed their testimony, and you could see that there was a lot of threat and intimidation. And I think once we saw that through the police files that Stannard and Strong were guilty, the question was to be asked, why did they really want Holmes shut up? To kill somebody the night before a coronial inquiry is almost unheard of in Australian history. It was described in the papers as a gangster, a gangster type murder. And it was not because of reputations or anything like that. We believe that it dawned on us that Holmes in the witness box, with all his drug and alcohol problems, would have been made mincemeat by a barrister or Evatt probably, and his story about how Brady had disposed of Smith was just going to be, it would have revealed that it could have been pulled to pieces. So
I'm not sure the audience would realise that Reg Holmes had a suicide attempt on the harbour on his high-speed boat. That is detailed in the book, and also detailed is the enduring friendship between the two families, the Holmes and the Stannards. And these series of criminal events seem to have blown many friendships apart in the book. And that was one of the major ones. That was an enduring friendship and partnership that once Reg became what people would consider unstable and unreliable and not able to keep the secret, he was a very vulnerable person. So I think that comes through in the narrative quite strongly, and the friendship between Smith and Brady as well, I think.
Yeah. Look, I think the other thing was there were informers' notes that we found. There was an informer called number 17, and coming across one particular thing that number 17 had said, he'd written to Matthew's boss and said, "I know you are a Brady man, but the story I have to tell you is worth hearing." Now, I believe that this guy was giving information on Stannard and Strong, and we assume that the only story he could give in this context was that that Stannard and Strong had killed both men. And also we got photos from in Deep Archive because Sam Hood, the photographer, had taken some photos of the inquest because it was recorded, but they had never been seen before. And these were taken on the morning of the inquest. And if I can't share anymore. I can't get back to my, or maybe I can. Yes, I can.
Green share screen. Yep.
Are you seeing that now, or seeing any photos?
Not yet. No. So, Kev, can you hear me?
You there, Phil?
I don't think Phil's there, but I'm here.
I think it was Phil.
Yes, I think we have too. Could we continue our discussion, Kev, until Phil comes back?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Were you going to ask me about the women and the men's lives?
Yes, I think if we can continue on with that, I find this one of the most fascinating questions in the book. Could you please elaborate on some of the very strong female personalities that are involved in this true crime saga?
The three most obvious women to speak about are Grace Brady, the wife of Paddy, Arnie Holmes, the wife of Reg, and Gladys Smith, the wife of Jim. Look, there's no denying that the lives of these women were profoundly and tragically impacted by the men that they married. Every one of them could be commented upon in terms of her stoicism. They remain steady by the sides of their husband, come hell or high water. And it was probably because that was what was expected of married women, and especially if they had no other means of support. But these men, in many ways, deserved to be let go of by their wives, but they stuck with them. On one case, when Patrick Brady was arrested, his wife came with him, and she slept at she stayed at the Central Police Headquarters where the CIB was for 2 or 3 nights, and she was looked after there by female policewomen, I should say. So it's an extraordinary loyalty that they showed. In the case of Arnie Holmes and Gladys Smith, their worst fears, and they were very ongoing, long-held and ongoing fears, their worst fears were realised when both of their husbands were murdered. Gladys Smith was so afraid that in 1934 she insured Jim's life, and 12 months, within 12 months, she had received payment on that life when he was killed in 1935. Arnie Holmes would have been very well aware of her husband's vulnerability to an early death, either by his own hand or by criminals who were blackmailing him, or possibly even by. We think that Reg Holmes had drug and alcohol addictions, and he wasn't a well man, physically or mentally. Arnie Holmes also feared for her children. Her kids were mentioned in various as being targets in various circumstances. Grace Brady, she prayed. She was a deeply religious woman. She prayed that Paddy would change. But Paddy, well, when Paddy was he was never around the family. If he was not in jail, he was in the pub, and if he wasn't in jail or the pub, he was in Queensland or in Tasmania or in the regional districts of New South Wales on some kind of cheque forging spree. He was a very
Yes, I felt very sorry for the women, especially Paddy's 3 sisters, who stumped up 3 title deeds to their house as bail for him in the final instance. So whatever class of woman that it was, they were really fighting an uphill battle with the men that they married, as you said. I'm conscious of the time, gentlemen, so I think we do need to keep on moving along a little bit to give people some time for questions. I would like people to post any questions that they have for you now, and I'll try and collate them. We have 1 or 2 more questions to take us to the conclusion of the author's talk. You have some new information on the case, this criminal cases, that has come to light in this publication. Can you let us know what that is, Phil and Kev? And welcome back, Phil.
Phil received a note from a woman to say that her grandfather worked for Stannard, and he was a boat driver for Stannard, and frequently he was operating the boat at night. On one night when he was expected to take the boat out on business, he got a call from Stannard saying that the boat wouldn't be needed. He wanted to take charge of the boat that night because they had a job to do, and that night was the night that Smith disappeared. So draw from that what you may. I did an ABC interview in one of the regional stations. A man phoned back within an hour, and he said that his father worked in the Holmes boat shed, and as an apprentice marine engineer. As he finished his apprenticeship, he went to the office to tell Mrs. Holmes that he was going to resign, and he and another guy were going to start a boat shed just along the way. Well, he copped a torrent of abuse, and then Mrs. Holmes opened a desk drawer, and she put a gun on the desk and said, "We'll kill you." And well, he didn't get killed, he survived, but it was a very strange response when this man spoke to her.
Just with Robin Gracie's information about her step-grandfather, who was a Stannard employee, and the boat, that is, she's written that, and that's now part of our archive, which we are happy to share with people. We have an email address, sharkarmforum@yahoo.com. And we've got information. These bits of information have come through there. Part of what we would like to do is hear from anyone who had any connection with the Hobsons, because in terms of the Hobsons, there were some things in the police reports that were quite alarming about their involvement in smuggling. We would like to pursue, if anyone has any information on the Hobsons, if they can contact us through that, that would be absolutely fantastic. But we are sure that Robin Gracie's information is correct, and it verifies the conclusions that we came to, that that both James Smith and Reginald Holmes were killed by the same people, Albert Stannard and Patrick Strong, and 3 other men who were associates.
I'd just like to remind people, Philip, that the Hobsons were the proprietors of the Coogee Aquarium, and close to the end of the book, you go into a double investigation that Detective Matthews was set on to investigate the police drug squad and that uncovered evidence that the Hobsons were picking up drugs off the coast, south coast of New South Wales. So at this stage, we would refer people to the book to actually read your investigation and your theories on exactly how involved the Hobsons could have been in the drug smuggling trade in Sydney at the time. So that's very interesting, new developments in what is quite an old legal case. What do you think are the major achievements of this book, either Phillip or Kevin, to wind us up tonight?
Look, I think basically we have set the record straight. I think the information was always there. There were things in the police files, but the information was always there. But I think the link has not been made up until this time, because a very powerful man was acquitted of a murder. And until that man died, I think nobody went near the case. Subsequently, we were freed. You know, we're freed because it's a long time on. It's 85 years on, and we have made the link. It's hard to, I mean, it's very complex. So in this amount of time, it's hard to draw all those strings together. But I think we have drawn strings together that prove that Patrick Brady definitely did not kill his mate Jim Smith, and that Albert Stannard and Patrick Strong and his associates definitely killed both men. And as well as that, I think we give a pretty good picture of Sydney in the mid 1930s, with the corruption, the drugs, and the social life at the time. I think one thing that is very obvious, which the First World War, every second, either a crim or a policeman seemed to be carrying some wound from the First World War. And it was from Paddy Brady to the fingerprint man. The war had carved a terrible price through until that time. So I think it's good social history.
Can I ask how many years you and Kevin were researching the book, because you have so much primary research behind this narrative?
Well, look, what
was the question? Sorry, I couldn't quite hear it.
How many years have we been working on it? I think the main impetus was in 2009. We obtained all the police files, and we didn't. Yeah, look, those took a long time to absorb. So it's been a slow working through a lot of the piles of those the files, and also Trove has been an amazing tool, and also the state records out at Warrington. We've spent a lot of time out there, and the transcripts of the trials, the evidence itself. It was a privilege to see things that hadn't been seen in the evidence before. The actual note that Brady wrote telling Jim Smith's son that pretending to be his father. Things like that. The photo of James Smith, the only accurate photo that has so far been published of James Smith. All those things have been.
Can I add that frequently when we were going through the judicial transcripts over the inquests and the trials, things were said in the inquest which had to be ruled out, so they weren't included in the transcript. But that didn't stop the newspapers. So frequently, when something outrageous was said, it may have been struck out in the court, but it wasn't struck out as far as the press went. So this was one of Evatt's problems when he was having, particularly in the in the first inquest. But the combination of working with the transcripts and the newspaper coverage through Trove is a very effective way of operating, and we got a lot of we added a lot of substance to our thesis, I guess, by looking at both those two in coordination.
I must say it's a long time since I have met two researchers who show such enthusiasm and excitement looking at primary level documents. It has been a pleasure talking with you this evening. We have opened up the floor to Q&A from the online audience tonight. So far, I haven't had any more questions. There was a little bit of feedback about the aquarium pool. People remembered the swimming there. Marcellin College often took students down there apparently. Some people thought it was a 50-metre pool. I'm not sure that metrics would have applied, but we can always investigate that and get back to our online community. Kathy Nielsen, Councillor Nielsen has a question. Was the Truth newspaper your best source, she said. We have had this discussion offline during our rehearsals, and the fact that the proprietor of the Truth newspaper lived in Maroubra on the coast in a magnificent Victorian mansion. Up the other end of Torrington Road, Tilly Devine had her country retreat from the inner city. So he certainly had plenty of subject matter to get on with in his locality between the Shark Arm murders and what was going on at the end of his own street. But as you've come to the conclusion that there was so much trafficking up and down the coast, it makes me wonder whether the Widow's Walks on the top of his property were an outpost for him to observe comings and goings. Do you have any theories on that? And do you have any theories on the detectives being pressured by such sensationalist newspapers to get a result at all costs, whether it was right or not, whether the right person was convicted?
I think we are pretty certain that that Matthews and Allman, both of them are the detective sergeants in the investigation, they were under a lot of pressure to get a result. And as I outlined earlier, the evidence against Brady was pretty weak, had very little substance in it. But they had to go, it sounded like to us that they had to make that arrest. At least that was one headline which they could claim, which would keep the truth quiet for a while. But they were under a lot of pressure, and that's why it seems to us that they might have put all their eggs in one basket and chose Brady. Phil?
It was a pretty good paper, you know, like reading the issues that reported on the Shark Arm. I mean, they had photos that nobody else had, the boring old Sydney Morning Herald and the Labor Daily, and, you know, they were very standard, just straight reporting. But the Truth had, you know, a lot of primary photos, and they did a lot of their own research. They got out there, they interviewed Gladys Smith before the police got to her. So they hounded the police by staying one step ahead of them. And the interesting fact is that in the police files, almost the biggest part of the police files that we got are newspaper reports. So obviously the police were keeping those to stay ahead of the pack themselves, because they respected what especially Truth had dug up.
Okay, so we have a few more questions and we will be conscious of trying to wind up. Did they have an official register of tattoos at the time of the Shark Arm murder?
There were no official tattoos, but it was the tattoo was printed in the paper, and the brother and the wife both recognised the tattoo. Even just a physical description of two boxers boxing, they knew it was poor old Jim's.
The wife was taken to view the arm, and the tattoo had been sliced off the arm during the coronial inquest. So that is all detailed in the book. So I thought that was pretty intense for a person who wasn't even sure if their partner was dead or alive. So
very intense.
it is. Darren has asked the question, do you have a new project or book planned?
Look, there's numerous. I don't know about the Pajama Girl of that era. That would be an interesting thing. There has been a book written, but that was back in 2007. So that would be an interesting project. Another unsolved murder of the year, and a lot of the same detectives worked on that. So that was all part of the push to get a result, that they couldn't solve that one, and then 6 months later, this one comes along. There's also Mackay, the police commissioner, was an incredible character. You know, staunch and straightforward and honest in many ways, but you know, a pretty hard man in others. And yeah, look, many projects.
Yeah, Tim has done some research online, and he said the aquarium baths were upgraded in 1937 and lengthened from 50 yards to 55 yards so that they could accommodate the metric races to be held in conjunction with the Empire Games in 1938. So thanks
Tim.
His source is online, Coogee Media. I do have to give a shout out to the book that was also published by the Randwick Coogee Swimming Club that details the history of their club, and the venue for their club was the Coogee Aquarium Pool. So they go into it a lot, and the image that we shared with you is in that publication. That's available at Randwick City Library. Deb White, who also commented before that her son finds the shark arm case a ripping yarn, as do all school students that visit the library, and as did your students when you're at high school. But Deb is now asking, what happened to the arm in the end, and does James Smith have a grave?
James Smith does not have a grave. He was given what was called a Sydney send-off. So he had a watery grave. Sorry, what was the other part of the question? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'll just put that away. What happened to the arm in the end?
Well, it was sent away during the coroner's inquest to have analysis done to it. And I guess the police never thought that the arm would completely disappear, but in testing for chemicals, because they had to test whether, you know, it had been embalmed, because in the early days they thought it might have been maybe it was a medical specimen that had been thrown into the pool. But in doing that, all of the arm was used in that analysis. So the only thing that came back and was preserved for a time was a lump of flesh that had the tattoo on it. So that's all that remained. And I would imagine Castle says that he remembered seeing the tattooed skin at some point much later, but we never came across anything as grotesque as that.
Okay, we have the final two questions here from our online forum. The comment, fascinating story with colourful characters and localities. I await the movie or mini-series, and I think you two guys could take that to the next level. with your background, maybe get Baz Luhrmann involved. Yeah, I think
yes,
we will await that development.
Hopefully.
And Alexandra has asked, what did you do to celebrate the end of the writing and publishing of this book?
I've forgotten. What did we do?
I don't know. Did we walk down to Coogee and throw some flowers into the water? And I don't know. No, look, it was a big thrill to, you know, be picked up by Alan and Unwin, and neither of us had written anything before, and you know, to have it published was a great thrill for us. So we certainly celebrated, you know, with a champagne once we knew that was happening.
Yeah, it's a fantastic read, guys, and it's very hard to take the dry facts of primary documents and weave a narrative through it that makes it such a gripping yarn. So I really enjoyed it. It brings history to life. And I think there's no more Q&A from the floor. So I think that will conclude our formal proceedings tonight.